Om Prithvi Shantirantariksha Shantir Dev Shantir Disha Shantiravantara Disha Shantiragni Shantir Vayu Shantiraditya Shantish Chandrama Shantir Nakshatrani Shantirapa Shantiroshadaya Shantir Vanaspataya Shantir Gau Shantiraja Shantirashva Shantir Purusha Shantir Brahma Shantir Brahmana Shanti Shantireva Shanti Shantir Me Astu Shantihi. May there be peace on earth and in the sky. May there be peace in the water and in all directions. May there be peace in the plants, in the trees, and in animals. May there be peace in the hearts of all beings. May there be peace in everyone and in everything. Sarvetra sukhinas santu, sarve santu niramayaha, sarve bhadrani pashyantu, ma kaschid dukkha bhag bhavet, sarvastaratu durgani, sarvo bhadrani pashyatu, sarvasat sadbuddhimapnotu, sarvas sarvatra nandatu. May all be happy and healthy. May all see what is good, and may no one experience misery. May all overcome their obstacles and acquire good tendencies. May people everywhere find joy and fulfillment. Let us now spend some time touching the center of peace and joy in our hearts. A good way to begin the practice is to withdraw the scattered energies of the mind and bring them to rest on one point. That point can be our own breathing. Let us therefore practice breathing with awareness. As we breathe in, let us visualize that our body and mind are being filled with love, strength, and compassion. And as we breathe out, let us release all the stress, anxiety, and exhaustion in the body and mind. Let us practice this way for a while. Let us now turn our attention to the region of our heart. Although God is present everywhere and in everyone, the divine presence can be felt most clearly in our own hearts. We can meditate in any way we have been taught. To focus our mind, we can take the help of a prayer or a mantra or a divine name. Let us now spend some time dwelling on the presence of God in our hearts. Om Asatoma Satkamaya Tamasoma Jyotirgamaya Mrityorma Amritam Gamaya Aviravir Maheti Rudrayatte Dakshinam Mukham Te Namam Pahi Nityam. May the Divine lead us from the unreal to the real, from darkness to light, from death to immortality. May the Divine Consciousness fill our hearts and protect us. So we'll continue our study of the layer of the mind. So we begin with verse 168. Panchendriyai panchabhireva hotrubhihi prachiyamano vishayajya dharaya chajvalyamano bahuvasanendhanaihi manomayagnir dahati prapancham. The fire of the layer of the mind, which is tended with the fuel of numerous desires by the five senses, who serve as five priests, and set ablaze with the ghee stream of sense objects, burns the universe. So the power of the layer of the mind is described here with an analogy, just as in these fire sacrifices, sometimes called the Homa. So there will be this set of priests, there is a fire in the middle, and they offer oblations into the fire. And the oblations are usually of ghee, but to keep the fire going, you also need fuel. So this analogy now is applied to what is happening in the layer of the mind. So the layer of the mind, the Manomaya Kosha, is the fire here. Now it is in this fire, the five senses are the five priests. Many of these Vedic sacrifices needed not just one priest, sometimes a number of them. So five priests now, that is each of the senses which brings sensory data from the external world is a priest. So usually what happens is, in a puja, the priests are the one, when the fire worship, they tend the fire. They make sure that the fire is burning. They are the ones who make oblations into it. So here, each sense, so the sense of sight brings all these forms and colors. The sense of hearing brings in all the sounds. So all these things that the senses bring in, now they will be offered as oblations. So the sense objects in the world, they stand for ghee, which is offered as an oblation. But before the ghee is offered, you need something to keep the fire going. You need some good fuel. The fuel for the fire here is the samskaras that generate desire. We have seen on many occasions how desire springs in the heart, that all of our past actions, both physical actions and thoughts, which are mental actions, each of them generates an impression in the mind. And it is these impressions that get triggered and come up as vasana or desire. And a simple example I often give about this is that if you have never drunk coffee before, let's say, it will be difficult to find someone who has never drunk coffee. But suppose you find someone who has never ever drunk coffee, then the first time they drink coffee, and if they enjoy it, or even if they hate it, either way, it generates also, along with that experience of joy or sorrow, depending on whether they like it or not, the second effect that occurs is it generates a coffee impression in the heart. Now, if my first experience was that it brought me joy, then next time anything external, say I'm passing by a coffee shop, or I remember or internal memory of my first cup of coffee, that can provide the stimulation, or that can trigger that existing coffee samskara, and then that coffee samskara comes up as a desire. So the samskaras are in the unconscious part of the mind. And so it springs up as a desire, comes up in the conscious part. Just like in a boiling pot of water, just like water bubbles up from the bottom and comes up to the surface, the samskaras are in the bottom of the mind, so to speak, and it generates into a desire, and we become aware of the desire, only it comes in the conscious part of the mind. So that is how samskaras generate desire. And it is these samskaras that generate desire, they are the fuel which keeps this fire going. There's a beautiful definition of desire given in ancient texts. In Sanskrit it goes like this: Drida bhavanaya tyakta purva apara vicharanam yat adanam padarthasya vasana sa prakirtita. Which means all of the information or all of the experiences that the senses bring from outside, sound, smell, taste, all of those things, if I just accept them firmly, unquestioningly, without thinking about the consequences, then that kind of an intentional activity, that is what desire is. That is, if we pause and think like, oh, this is not good for me, then it can be stopped. But if I do it mindlessly, just whatever is coming from the external world, just take it in, and that shows my desire for the external world, so that I don't want to put any filters there. So desire, therefore, is the dry fuel that feeds this fire. Without it, without desires, the sense objects, merely the sense objects, cannot sustain the fire for long. So in order for this fire, the covering of the mind to remain active, it has to be fed. And the feeding won't occur if there are no desires. And that is why, as long as we have desires, the layer of the mind is active, it's strong, it's firm. And as long as that layer is firm, we are not free, because it is covering us. That is the connection. And that is why it is this fire, this verse ends by saying, it burns the universe. In other words, as long as the fire is burning brightly, we become unfit for enlightenment. And that is why oftentimes in the text they speak about, if you want to put out the fire, the first thing you have to do is switch off the supply of fuel to it. If you are feeding the fire, then it cannot be stopped. And that's why oftentimes in books they speak about the importance of controlling desire, because it is desire that feeds this fire. You might remember an incident in Holy Mother's life. She went to a pilgrimage to the Jagannath temple in Puri, which is one of the very sacred pilgrimages that people often do in India. And because Sri Ramakrishna had never gone to Puri Jagannath, we read in a book that she actually carried a small photograph of Sri Ramakrishna. And as she sat there before the altar, she said she just held that photo so that at least in that way Sri Ramakrishna could have darshan, because Sri Ramakrishna had a great, great reverence for the presence of the divine in that very ancient temple. Now, something very interesting happened in that temple. There is an ancient saying that those who have darshan of Jagannath in Puri, that they will be liberated. Rathe Vamanam Drishva Punarjanma na Vidyate. Ratha, there is one of the famous, probably one of the very well-known festivals connected with Jagannath is this big chariot festival. It's called Rathayatra. And so there is this saying that whoever has darshan of Jagannath in that chariot, in that Ratha, Punarjanma na Vidyate, they will not be born again. In other words, they will be liberated. They will get out of this cycle of samsara. And so Mother was sitting there before the Jagannath altar in the temple, and this thought came to her mind: how blessed are all these hundreds and thousands of people who are coming to the temple to have darshan of Jagannath, and they don't have to be born again. They will all be liberated. And then Mother said, as soon as that thought came to her mind, she heard a voice, a very clear voice saying, unless you become desireless, you cannot be liberated. You cannot get moksha. And it was such a powerful, clear voice that Mother was stunned, because it was just came all of a sudden, that voice. It was a divine voice that she heard. And it's kind of an interesting experience, because next to Mother, one of her, a great devotee, her name appears often in Mother's life, called Yogin Ma. She was also sitting next to Mother. And Mother looked at her, and Yogin Ma, who was herself a very advanced spiritual seeker, she also heard that voice. So it's a very powerful vision, not completely subjective in some sense, because two of these amazing people sitting there, they both heard it at the same time. And it's a very powerful message, very relevant to what we are studying now, that unless the word Mother heard was nirvasana, until these vasanas completely go away, we cannot be liberated. And that is what is being said here, that it is these desires, they provide the fuel that keep the fire going. So we can see what a vital role the layer of the mind performs in keeping us to this, bound to this world. As we saw last time, the layer of the body, problematic as it can be, it's going to go away after a few years. A new layer will come. It's almost like not getting a new car, but getting a new body on your car. The engine remains same. If in the car analogy, if you think of the engine as the mind and the body of the car as the body, then it's possible to go to a body shop and completely get a fresh body. But we don't get a new engine, and therefore we have to take extra care of the engine, because the body can be changed, but the engine is, we are stuck with that engine. You cannot really get a new car in that sense, in this samsara analogy. So it's a beautiful imagery providing about how the senses act as the priests. Look at the next verse, 169. Nahi asti avidya manasotirikta mano hi avidya bhavabandha hetuhu tasmin vinashte sakalam vinashtam vijrumbhite asmin sakalam vijrumbhate. There is no ignorance apart from the mind. The mind itself is ignorance, the cause of bondage of this world. When the mind disappears, everything disappears. When it manifests, everything becomes manifests. And as we saw just now, among the body and the mind is more sustaining. The body has a limited shelf life to some extent. Give and take 100 years at the most. But the mind lives for a much longer time because the mind is more subtle. That which is subtle, that which is finer, has a longer life than that which is more tangible. Between the hardware and software, the hardware can break down, but the software has a much longer life. It's like that. So the mind can be the cause of bondage because whenever the mind is present, whenever the mind is active, then the sense of I, it attaches itself to the body and mind. And when the mind is absent, the sense of I detaches itself from the body and mind. We know that the mind, therefore, is present both in the waking state and in the dream state. And therefore, in both of these states, our ego is also present. Our ego is present now, which is why all the action that we do, we feel, I am doing this. Or whatever we are experiencing in life, I feel I am experiencing it. Now, this ego is present even in the dream state, which is how next morning when we wake up and say, last night I dreamt, I did this, I saw this, I experienced this. So the I is present, attached to a body and mind, both in waking and in dream states. And that is where the mind is present. Now in deep sleep state, in Sushupti, the mind merges itself, so to speak, goes back to its source, because mind is a product of ignorance. And therefore the mind, you could say figuratively, merges back into ignorance. Therefore, ignorance is all that remains in the deep sleep state. And because the mind is not active, because the mind is not present, so to speak, in its normal form, therefore there is no sense of I in deep sleep. And because there is no sense of I in deep sleep, we don't have any problem in deep sleep. Well, there is the problem of ignorance, but we don't experience any bondage, we don't experience any stress, any anxiety, any worry, nothing. And so that is why it is said, the mind is itself ignorance. It is the cause of bondage of this world. Because the bondage, you see, it's very interesting. What is bound? I mean, the word bondage keeps on coming again and again. And one way to understand bondage is to be subservient or to be controlled by laws outside of ourselves. So in some sense, we are not really fully free. And as I often say, if you want to drive a car, there is a speed limit. You cannot, there are some streets where you're not allowed to go. It's all one-way streets. And so there are all these rules. So your freedom is restrained or controlled by all these rules. As long as there are rules and laws which prevent us from doing something, we cannot say we are totally free. Now the mind and the body, both are material entities. And because they are made of matter, they have to follow the laws of matter. And as long as they are under any law, they are not really free. So true freedom means there is nothing stopping you from anything. There is no external force trying to say you do this or you don't do this. And therefore, as long as the mind is present, there is the I, and that I is attached to the body and mind. The body and mind are material, and therefore is under law, therefore not free. Now when the mind disappears, as in deep sleep, it is that time then you kind of have a sense of freedom. You're not really free because there is still ignorance, but at least the kind of bondage we experience in waking and dream that kind of bondage is not present in deep sleep. So, when the mind disappears, everything disappears. That is, body, mind disappear. When it manifests in dream and in waking, everything becomes manifest. And this is pretty obvious. So this idea is elaborated further in next verse, 170. Swapne arthashunye srujati swashaktya bhoktradi vishvam mana eva sarvam tathaiva jagratyapino visheshah tat sarvametat manaso vijrumbhanam. In the dream state, when there is no contact with anything external, the mind alone, with its own power, projects the world consisting of the experiencer, etc. It is no different in the waking state as well. All of this is the projection of the mind. It sometimes may be difficult to understand that the world is the projection of the mind in the waking state, because we are kind of conditioned in thinking about that the world is out there. It's a fascinating way of thinking. Is the world out there and that is why I'm seeing it? Or because I'm seeing it, the world is out there? Which comes first? And that's the difference between the psychology of perception in modern science and the way it is seen in the Eastern traditions. Now, when I see a certain object, the material sciences take it for granted that there is some object outside. And then the idea is, well, here is this object, light strikes this object, it enters into my eye, then there is a reflection on the retina, goes to the optic nerve, and then that sensation is interpreted, and then I am able to see and know what this object is. But it begins with this assumption that there is this object outside. Now in Vedanta, that thing is completely flipped the other way. That because my mind goes out and because there is ignorance, I'm seeing things that may not be there. And the classical example, of course, always is that of the rope and snake. I'm seeing the snake, which is not really there. The snake is a projection of the mind. Exactly in the same way, this world is a projection of the mind. Now that's so difficult to, intellectually kind of it might be a fascinating idea, but it's so difficult to think about it spontaneously as we go about our day-to-day activities. But it's a little bit easier when you think about the dream experience. Now, when we dream, perhaps we're just in our room, the lights are switched off, we are lying in our bed, and we are asleep. And then suddenly, this whole new world opens up before us. Maybe someone else in the same room who is awake doesn't see anything. They're just seeing that room, that's all. But I am seeing this beautiful thing. Maybe I'm in Bahamas and I'm seeing mountains and trees and everything. So that is a little bit easier to say that how that can be the projection of the mind. Because the eyes are closed, I'm in my room, the room is dark, it's pitch dark outside, it's night, and yet my mind is projecting all this scenario for bright sunshine in the island of Bahamas, or I'm just kind of swimming there, I'm doing all kinds of things there. So what this verse points out is, just as the dream world is a projection of the mind, this world that we see is also a projection of the mind. And if you just think about it a little bit, we don't know a dream to be a dream until we wake up. As long as we are in the dream, it is very real to us. And therefore, right now, this very moment, this could be a dream. Because how would we know that this is not a dream? Because we are in it. We would know that this is not a dream only when we wake up. And that is why a little bit of a reflection makes it clear. But such is the power of Maya, then the moment you walk out now, the moment we close this book, again it's like, no, this is very real. That's how the mind goes back to its old ways of thinking. So that is what this verse is pointing out. That just as the dream state is a projection of the mind, it is no different in the waking state as well. All of this is the projection of the mind. In other words, there is no world, either when we are awake or when we are dreaming, which is apart from the mind. It's just the mind playing its tricks. Verse 171. Sushupti kale manasi praline naivasti kinchit sakala prasiddhehe ato manakkalpita eva pumsaha samsara etasya navastutosti. It is well known to all that in deep sleep, when the mind subsides, there is nothing whatsoever. Hence, this samsara is only in the person's mind and is not real. So it is the power of Maya that makes us feel that there is something really out there. And the reality is that only one reality exists. There is nothing outside, nothing inside. There is no outside inside. When we say out, something out there, even when you use the language like that, something out there, then you say, out of what? Where is this outside and inside? Swami Vivekachudamani mentions in his Jnana Yoga lectures that in one school of little children, one of the questions the teacher asked was, they were having some basic class on astronomy. And to little children, you can't really go into too many details. But one thing was clear, that all of these astronomical bodies, these planets and stars, and all are just up there in the space, this vast cosmic space. And so the teacher asked the student, why doesn't the earth fall? I mean, there is no stand on which the earth is standing. So it's just up there in space. Why doesn't it fall? And then Swamiji says, one bright student gets up and says, where should it fall? I mean, there is no up and down in space. Up and down, east, west, north, south are just conventional ways of speaking. But in this infinity, there you cannot speak about up and down. So similarly, in the idea about the world being out there, the words inside and outside are meaningless, because we have this kind of a fictitious boundary that this body is, it's like if I am a nation state, if I am a country, then this is my boundary. Everything outside this boundary is out. Everything inside is inside. But as we saw, the body itself is such a perishable entity. Not just perishable when we die. Every moment at the quantum level, at the molecular, the atomic level, the particles of this body are continually being exchanged with the external universe. Even the body is not constant. And so this idea of inside and outside is just created by the power of Maya. And that's the kind of question in Vedanta they ask, that when I mistake a rope for a snake, where is the snake really? Is the snake there, or is the snake in my mind? Because it's possible that another person standing next to me with better eyesight than me is just seeing a rope there. And I'm in deluded something. No, it's not a rope, it's a snake. So is the snake there, or is the snake here? Um, about a fortnight ago, I wrote a small blog about this, about the different views about the psychology of misperception, if you like, the psychology of error. When we make a mistake, when we mistake one thing for another, how does that error occur? What makes that error possible? So take a look if you haven't seen that, and you will see that a lot of different schools of thought have given their mind to thinking about this. Why do people make mistake? Why do people see things differently or see things which are not there? And so that is what is the idea here. So because there is nothing out there, what we see out there can be very different. What an ignorant person sees out there and what an enlightened being sees out there can be very different. Which is why when you and I, equally ignorant, we look out and we just see the world as it is. And we therefore, because we assume that every one of us is seeing the same world, we believe the world is out there. Otherwise, how could we all see the same thing? But then suppose Sri Ramakrishna were present here and ask him, what do you see? Not that he wouldn't see this. Of course, he could see this. Depending on, suppose he is in his highest samadhi, then it would just be immersed in that oneness. Then there was this second, a kind of an intermediate state that Sri Ramakrishna often passed by. And sometimes in Bengali or in Sanskrit, they call it Ardha-Bahya Dasha. There is kind of semi-conscious. But semi-conscious is meant that not he was unconscious and conscious at the same time, but he was conscious of this apparent reality, the projection of the Maya, but also conscious of a deeper reality behind it. So he could see, then it probably in that kind of a state, Sri Ramakrishna would say, this is the play of the Divine Mother. So you can see that if this world is out there, then all of us would see exactly the same thing. And yes, granted, 99.9% of us feels as if we are all seeing the same thing. But we cannot totally discard the experience of those whom we see as enlightened beings, because they saw something very different. Now, if they were deluded, deranged minds, then we don't have to take them seriously. But the problem is opposite. You could say that spiritual enlightenment, there is no majority rule. You cannot say, well, most of us see this way, and therefore this is right. And Sri Ramakrishna only saw the Divine Mother, so he was probably crazy, which actually people thought. During his time, people thought, well, he's seeing things which we none of us see, so he is something wrong with his head. But once we take spiritual life seriously and begin to think about it, and then we know that only a handful of these people may have seen things differently, but they are the only ones who are seeing things as they are. The rest of us are deluded. It's a little bit like if you go to a bar, especially on a festive occasion, when people just go there to drink. And it's possible that if people are just drinking indiscriminately, then most of the people there are probably intoxicated. But then the person who is dispensing the drinks, at least hopefully, that person is fully sober. So now, if what the majority is experiencing is normal, then what the majority are experiencing in the bar, it could be very different from this one person who is sober. But that one person really is seeing things, thinking things through in a completely sane way. Or if you go to a mental institution, again, it's possible that the patients there who may be suffering from different kinds of illnesses, they may be in a much larger number And maybe the doctors and the staff may be numerically smaller. And yet we cannot say the majority there, what they say and what they think and what they do, that's real because more people are doing it. So in spiritual life, it's the majority not always right. In fact, the majority is usually wrong. And it's these few enlightened beings, they know the truth. So it's good to keep that in mind. Look at verse 172. Vayuna aniyate meghaha punastenaiva niyate manasa kalpyate bandho mokshastenaiva kalpate. The bondage is imagined by the mind, and freedom is also imagined by the mind. Just as a cloud is brought by the wind and is also carried away by the wind. There is this beautiful statement in an Upanishad called the Amrita Bindu Upanishad, which says, Mana eva manushyanam karanam bandha mokshayoho. The mind alone is the cause of bondage, and the mind alone is the cause of freedom. So here was this one question that can be asked in Vedanta. We all say moksha is the goal. So the question that we can ask is, we speak about spiritual freedom. Who is it that becomes free? Because if we look at our composition of the personality, the body and mind are material. They are under material laws. They are never going to be free. They are always bound and perishable. The Atman is always free. And yet we say, oh no, we are in bondage and we want to be free. So who becomes free? Does the body become free? Does the mind become free? No, they can never be free. Does the Atman become free? But the Atman is always free. So who is the one who gets moksha? Who gets freedom? I asked this question once to my Vedanta teacher, and he just said, whoever think that they are bound, they are the one who strive for freedom and ultimately become free. So if you don't think you are bound, then you don't need freedom. And therefore, in order for the goal of moksha to become real to us, become relevant to us, we should feel bondage right now. Because it's not like some textbook telling you the goal is moksha. Unless we kind of feel it deep inside, we will not strive for moksha just because some book tells it to us. It's like this. A book might say, eating, drinking water is a good idea. But if you're not thirsty, just because the book is saying we're not going to do it, in order for me to drink water, I must feel thirsty. In order for me to eat something, I must feel hungry. So similarly, in order for moksha as a goal to become real in my life, I have to feel I'm in bondage. And that is why we have to look deeply at our own situation, but to look deeply at whatever we are experiencing outside and ask this question, is this freedom that I think I'm experiencing, is it real or is it an illusion of my mind? And if we begin to think deeply, then we might discover that we might think we are free, but ultimately we are all bound. Think about someone who is imprisoned for life with no, no parole? No parole, right? Parole, sorry. Yeah. So with no chance of parole, someone is in prison and has been already there, say, went there at a very young age and has been there for 30 years, has almost even forgotten or had no idea about the world outside. So for this person, on some day they say, oh, today for lunch there's going to be a feast. And he's like, wow. So if that's what my life has become limited to my prison life, to whatever restrictions I have gotten have become a part of my life, then let's say I'm allowed to go out and exercise and play only for 1 hour in a day. The rest of the time I'm locked up in my cell. And then someday they come and say, oh, beginning tomorrow, instead of 1 hour, you'll have 3 hours of freedom. And then you're going to rejoice, because that's something you never had. Or if your quality of your food improves, you're going to rejoice that, wow, I'm such a lucky person. But all of these joys that these prisoners get, they cannot wish away the fact that they are still inside that jail. They are not really free. So all of the joys that we experience in the world is that we are still imprisoned by our own body and mind, by our own ignorance. We can celebrate, we can have wonderful things happening, and that's great. But we have seen from our own experience in life, no joy, no happiness lasts for a long time. It just comes, we feel elated, we feel great, and then it all cools down. It leaves a good memory, that's true. But other than that, it goes. Now the positive side to that is, the same is true with pain and suffering as well. Again, just as joy, sukha comes and it goes down, dukkha comes, pain and suffering come, that also goes down. And we get just like a tennis ball being whacked in from both sides. That's who we are. Nature gives us some blow and we experience great pain and suffering, and we are thrown onto the other side. And then we have kind of wept and felt sorry for some time. The nature said, okay, all right, take a little rasagulla, take this. And then you're like, now life is wonderful. And then after some time, nature said, okay, now get another whacking. So our entire life can just pass from joy and sorrow, joy and sorrow, joy and sorrow. If that is not to happen, then we have to just pause and say, there has to be something deeper than merely sukha and dukkha. And when we look deeply, then we understand why Krishna said, having come to this joyless world, think of God alone. Anityam asukham lokam imam prapya bhajasvamam in the Gita. Anityam in this temporary, asukham in the joyless world, just pray to the divine. Or why the Buddha said, life is suffering. They didn't say joy and sorrow. They just said it's suffering. Because if we look deeply, we will see that all the joys and sorrows that we are experiencing in our life is like whatever these prisoners are experiencing in the prison system. No matter what happens, they are still within the prison. To be spiritual really means to not get overwhelmed, to not get carried away by these daily joys and sorrows, but think about this prison. How can I get out of this? Because that is the only permanent solution to the problem. And that is why the example here is, just as the cloud, it brings in the wind brings the cloud and the wind carries it away. Similarly, it is the mind that can bring bondage, the mind can bring freedom. There are these two statements in the Upanishad which look mutually contradictory. And that is this. One statement is, Natatra vag gacchati no manaha, this highest truth. None of the senses can go there. The speech cannot go there. You cannot express it. You cannot speak about it because the language is too fragile to describe what it is. The mind cannot reach. You cannot think about that. And so it's also one other phrase that is better known, is called Avang Manasa Gocharam. It is beyond the reach of the mind and the senses. So the mind seems like it's totally useless to know that highest reality. And in the another Upanishad, it says, Manasa eva idam aptavyam. Manasa eva idam aptavyam. This truth can be reached manasa eva, only by the mind. So one place we are told the mind cannot reach there, and the other place we are told the mind alone can take you there. So it clearly seems contradictory. And so that's why when we go to these enlightened ones, the commentaries, the explanations that they bring. So Shankaracharya therefore says, yes, the mind cannot reach there, but susamskritena manasa, the mind that is refined, the mind that is pure. When the mind becomes pure, then that kind of a mind will reveal the highest truth. That is why Sri Ramakrishna said, the pure mind, pure intellect, and pure Atman are one and the same thing. And therefore, all of the spiritual practices that we do are meant to purify the mind. The example I often give is of when you are driving and your windshield is cloudy and you cannot see what's there. And then there is a greater chance of an accident occurring. But the clearer the windshield becomes, then the driving itself can be such a joy, because you see the road, you know exactly when to stop, you know exactly when to turn. The mind is the windshield of our life. If the mind is confused, if the mind is cloudy, if the mind is dirty, then what I see through the mind, because the world that I see goes to the filter of my mind. And therefore, whatever I see will be colored by what is in my mind. So the more transparent, more clear, more pure my mind becomes, then it is that kind of a mind that will give me freedom. And that is what is said, that both the mind can increase my bondage and the mind can also free me. And this idea then is described in the verses that follow, which we will take up next week. So if you have any thoughts, ideas, comments, questions, feel free to ask. Yeah.
Hari Om Swamiji. Swamiji, you've often taught that in our daily life we want to be mindful. And today we've learned two things. One is that disappearing of the mind is necessary. And then you said purifying the mind is necessary or is helpful.
I mean, mind disappears naturally in deep sleep, of course. It shouldn't disappear in waking and dream sleep, but what we should do is kind of clear it. It becomes so transparent. Sometimes the windshield can be so clear, it's as if there is nothing in front. The mind should become like that.
So does practicing mindfulness, does that help us purify the mind?
Yeah, when we are mindful, it's like sometimes if I'm not mindful while driving, my windshield may not be completely transparent, but I will be seeing everything through that kind of cloudy, trying to see everything. Being mindful means whatever is happening in the mind, positive or negative, whatever is coming in, whatever is going out, I become aware of it. And if I become aware of it, then I know what should be allowed inside, what should not be allowed inside. So you could say that being mindful is a way of keeping the mind clean, keeping the mind pure, preventing the mind from accumulating garbage. Yeah. Come, Judajit.
Maharaj. So my question is, when one becomes enlightened, how does he or she know that this is the final truth and there is nothing beyond, or I have gone beyond Maya?
Okay, good. If we have doubt whether it's the final truth or not, then we can be sure it's not. One of the ways they say is that when that final experience is attained, then all doubts completely vanish. So if ever we feel, I've realized something, but I'm not sure whether it is ultimate or not, we can be sure it's not. So what I think for the safest for every one of us, in the course of our spiritual practice, we will have different experiences, which is good, which can be very encouraging. But at no stage, it's always good to be skeptical, or healthily skeptical of all of our experiences. And I say that because if an experience is genuine, then even if I'm skeptical of it, it will do the benefit it is supposed to do. But if it's not genuine, if it's something that's just transitory and my mind is just kind of felt something good upon some day, then being skeptical of it keeps us safe, rather than just thinking, oh, I've had some amazing experience and live in one's own la-la land, so to speak. So a healthy skepticism is very helpful in spiritual life. Yeah. Chandi?
Thank you, Maharaj. In our deep sleep, the mind disappears. But you said still we are in bondage. How can it be bondage if the mind disappears?
Yeah, good question. Yeah, so we could say, if it makes us feel any better, we could say, well, we are kind of liberated in deep sleep. But this kind of liberated is really no liberation, because we cannot remain in deep sleep forever. Whether we like it or not, we are going to wake up again. And that's why we are not liberated, because the mind disappears, but the mind is not destroyed. So there are two different things. Something disappearing for a while and something being vanquished completely. So the mind kind of merges for a little while in ignorance. That is why that experience of deep sleep comes and we don't experience the world or anything. But the mind has not vanished. It is there in a seed form. And because it is there in a seed form, again it comes out in the waking state. So the goal, in some sense, is really, and it's going to sound terrible, but that's the truth, is to destroy the mind. There is a book called the Jivan Mukti Viveka. It has one whole big section called Manonasha. Because the Deha Nasha, the destruction of the body, is going to occur, whether I like it or not. Sooner or later, as I said, maximum in a full human life, 100 years, give and take a few years here and there, this body is going to be destroyed. I don't have to work very hard to do that. But the mind is so subtle, it lives on and on and on. As long as the mind is, and it can disappear for a short time in deep sleep, but it's not dead. So I have to find a way of because the mind carries all my karma, mind carries all memories, mind carries all samskaras. Every thing necessary for a new life to be generated is there in the mind. So as long as those seeds are present, the forest is going to come. The trees, you cannot stop the tree from growing, the grass from growing. So if you want to just remove it completely, the mind has to be destroyed. And so in deep sleep, the mind is not destroyed. It just goes to sleep, you could say. Yeah. Yeah.
Swamiji, I just want to understand more about the bondage. Who is producing the bondage? Because body, who is doing the activity, it's not producing. The mind, who is creating the activity, it's not producing. Even though we say that mind is the all culprit, but the same mind enlightened people also has. So how is bondage is producing?
Yeah, good question. The answer is, we don't know. The answer is that all that we know is if we look deeply at our condition, we don't feel free. That's all that can be said. Because, I mean, the answer cannot be given because the question assumes that we are in bondage. The answer actually questions that assumption itself. Because if the only reality is Atman or Brahman, which is ever free, which was never in bondage, then how can we even ask the question, how does bondage come? Because we can ask the question how the bondage comes only on the assumption that the bondage has come. And Vedanta actually questions that assumption itself. Then we say, well, if it has not come, why am I experiencing it? For the same reason as there is no snake, but why am I seeing it? So just as I am seeing a snake which is not there, I am experiencing a bondage that is not there. And because I am experiencing the bondage that is not there, I must now experience a freedom to get rid of that bondage. I need an imaginary freedom to get rid of the imaginary bondage. So neither the bondage nor the freedom are real. So even our freedom, moksha, is not real. Now, understand in what sense I'm saying it. God alone is real. Moksha is not real. Because if moksha were real, then we have two realities, God and moksha. If there are two realities, then there is no non-duality. There is no Advaita. There is no oneness because you have two now. Even the knowledge of Brahman is not real. Because the ignorance of Brahman is not real. And so the only reality is Brahman. And so because we have the feeling of bondage, that feeling of bondage can only be removed by the feeling of freedom. Yeah, that's essentially it. Is that okay? Is that clear? Yeah. Yes, sir. Yeah.
Swamiji, from the psychological perspective of bondage, people feel bondage if they feel like they're compelled to do something that they don't really want to do. That's, maybe one way that many people feel bondage. They feel compelled beyond their control to do things they don't want to do. So, as one way to overcome bondage in that sense is to not feel that you're compelled, but to feel that it's something that you want to do, or to feel that, it's something that just needs to be done. I mean, so from a psychological perspective, how can you overcome bondage?
Yes, good. The problem right now is that even when we do what we want to do, we are doing what we want to do because we are forced to do it. I know this is going to sound contradictory, but when I say I want to do something, that I may not feel I'm being forced to do it, but the idea that I'm doing something out of freedom is also an illusion. It's a little bit like, oh, when I'm hungry, I go and get myself food and eat it. I'm a free person. I go and eat food. But no, I'm not free. My body is hungry, and my body is saying, get me food. And so then the body is the master here. And I'm like a servant and say, oh, you are feeling uncomfortable. Let me go and put some food there. But rather than recognizing things for what they are, it also, the Maya creates an illusion. No, no, the body is not the master. You are the master. But no, we are not the master. The mind plays so many tricks upon us. We just weep and smile, and we think we're doing it out of freedom. No, it's the mind. It's the mind that is forcing me to react in this way or the other way. But at the same time, it's, sometimes it's like the people who have pets, for instance. Suppose someone takes a dog out for a, if you have a dog, you naturally have to walk them outside, take them at least 2 or 3 times a day, I think. And so someone might think, oh, I need to take my dog out for a walk. And there was this one cartoon I saw some time back. One dog is speaking with the neighbor's dog and saying, oh, it's 5 o'clock now, I need to take my master out for a walk. So the master thinks, I'm taking the dog out for a walk. The dog thinks, I'm taking this person out for a walk. So that's essentially how it is. And so, yeah, it's possible to have the sense of freedom out of illusion even when we are in bondage. And as I said, I gave the example of the prison. You can feel a lot of freedom inside the prison while remaining oblivious most of the time that you're still completely forget that there is a larger world outside. And the fish, for instance, can feel, I can go wherever I want in this big river or the well or the ocean, perhaps completely oblivious that there is this whole world out there which is not filled with water. So it's a little bit like that. Yeah. Okay, so we'll stop here now. So when we meet next week, we'll begin with verse 173. Om Jananim Saradam Devim Ramakrishnam Jagatgurum Padapadme Tayo Shritva Pranamami Muhur Muhuhum. On Sunday for satsang, our subject will be I and mine. And as you can imagine, we had a lot of talk about this. It's today as well. So it's the mind that creates this sense of I and mine by its attachment to the body. So you already know what I'm going to say on Sunday. But I might say something I didn't say today, so please come. On next Wednesday, we will continue with this study. As I said, we'll begin with verse 173. And on Saturday, our meditation will also continue as usual. Let's conclude with a prayer now. May the Divine Being, who is the Father in heaven of the Christians, Holy One of the Jewish faith, Allah of the Muslims, Buddha of the Buddhists, Tao of the Taoists, Ahura Mazda of the Zoroastrians, the Great Spirit of the Native Americans, and Brahman of the Hindus, lead us from the unreal to the real, from darkness to light, from death to immortality. May we be granted strength, freedom, and clear understanding. May we learn to see God in our own hearts and in everyone around us. May God bless us all and fill our hearts with gratitude, grace, and love. Om Shanti 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 Peace, peace, peace be unto all.